down now. You can sit down now. Great. So as you heard, I'm the co-founder of 1776 and currently the CEO of a business called Union. And for those of you who don't know, 1776 has been around for about 5 years, and we started with a couple of really central ideas. And the first was that a lot of kind of niche sectors of the economy, areas like healthcare, education, energy, transportation, food, which at the time were really seen as kind of smaller areas for technology to focus on, were about to become a lot more interesting and a lot bigger.
Yeah.
Another key idea that we started with at 1776 was that these weren't just going to be US opportunities, but these were going to be opportunities all around the world. And so over the last 5 years, we've built a venture fund, we've built an incubator, we've run a program called the Challenge Cup, we've had thousands and thousands of startups around the world compete in the Challenge Cup. This last year, we went to more than 75 different cities around the world. And one of the biggest things that I learned from all of those experiences and working with founders in Silicon Valley, New York, Nairobi, Dubai, here in Turkey, Singapore, all across the planet, is that the way that we are educating our entrepreneurs has one really giant missing flaw to it. And that flaw is knowledge and understanding of how to work with government, or as I put it, how to regulatory hack. And I want to sort of roll back a little bit and explain what I mean by that. So if you think about it, and for those of you guys who have actually been on the ground and spent time in Silicon Valley, and if not, if you follow it on Twitter, if you read it, if you study it, Silicon Valley loves to talk about how they're changing the world. Right? It's so central to the sort of identity of Silicon Valley, is this idea that entrepreneurs are going to build technology and they're going to make our lives better. They're going to solve the big problems in the world. But at the same time, the methodologies, the culture of Silicon Valley is one that teaches entrepreneurs, not just in the US, but all around the world, to sort of stay away from government. Government's slow, government's complex, government bogs you down. You want to go focus on the kinds of problems that can allow you to move really quickly, that can allow you to scale. Things like dating apps and sharing photographs and subscription cat food services and other really important problems. And it sort of strikes me that there's an interesting tension there, right? Because if you think about it, if you really want to solve the big, interesting problems that are going to impact people's lives, right, in pretty much every country around the world, certainly in America, in Turkey, in Europe, right, pretty much every country, pretty much every system of government, government tends to regulate the things that are most important to citizens. There's almost no country in the world with a functioning government that doesn't take a really strong view, for example, in food supply and where food comes from, the provisioning of healthcare, how children get educated. Pretty much every country I've been to, whether drivers believe them or not, has some sort of traffic laws to govern how cars move around in the streets, right? The reason that governments focus on these things is because they actually impact people's lives in really essential ways. People can die, right? People's livelihoods are at stake, and government tends to regulate those things. So if you as an entrepreneur want to go solve the really big important problems and you really want to impact people's lives, but you want to stay as far away from government as possible, right? There's an inconsistency there. And this was a relatively minor one for the last 10, 15 years because so much of technology was focused on relatively lightweight media-type things. But if you think about the big, giant technologies out there right now, the kinds that entrepreneurs all around the planet are getting excited about, the kinds that venture capitalists are getting excited about, right? Things like blockchain and Bitcoin, things like autonomous vehicles, artificial intelligence, robotics, automation overall, genomics, CRISPR, right? How we can actually start to edit life forms, brain-computer interface, right? These really big, exciting ideas. These are all ideas that are going to reach their full maturation, right? That are going to seize their biggest opportunities in the middle of unbelievably regulated sectors. Ones where government plays an incredibly dominant role. So when I say that the methodologies, the way that we're teaching our entrepreneurs is wrong, right? It's missing an understanding and a sophistication around this. What does that mean specifically? Right? The dominant methodology, right? How many of you guys have read The Lean Startup, or some variation of that, right? It is the book that pretty much every entrepreneur is told to read if they want to understand how they build a startup. And there's a lot about the Lean Startup that is great, right? It focuses on experimentation, forming hypotheses, rapidly gathering data to verify what you know, right? All of that stuff's right, but it applies it in a way that can take you down a wrong path when you're in a sector where you have to interface or engage with government. So let me take one simple example. The Lean Startup teaches us that we have to be unbelievably obsessive about our customer, right? We have to do everything about understanding that customer, testing what that customer needs, putting our product in front of that customer, and everything else is a distraction, and we've got to focus on that customer. Let's think for a little while about some of the sectors that present giant opportunities for entrepreneurs today. Healthcare is an example. Right, so if you look at healthcare, oftentimes, who's the customer of a healthcare app? Right? Is it necessarily the patient? Well, the patient may be benefiting from the healthcare app, but they may not be the customer. Right? Is it a nurse or a doctor? Well, they might be a user, but not necessarily the customer. Right? Maybe it's a hospital. Maybe it's government itself. Right? There's regulators that put rules in place that you have to be able to convince, in a lot of cases, to allow you to deploy a new technology in the healthcare setting. And so when you think about this simple question of who's your customer, you very quickly end up with a complex set of stakeholders. And you have to be able to solve a problem, create value for every one of those stakeholders to do something as simple as actually take your product to market and make it work. Right? You find that same dynamic repeats itself over and over again. You end up in these kinds of sectors with very, very complex power maps. And if you don't understand the needs and the wants of every single part of that value chain, right? A regulator, a government bureaucrat, a user, a beneficiary, the actual customer, you're going to ultimately get thwarted in your ability to enter that market. So this has implications in a lot of different areas. It has implications in how you go about testing and assessing and exploring your market. It has implications in how you think about business models. It has huge implications in how you actually grow and go to market. Right? One of the classic questions that a regulatory hacker has to face that's different from a regular startup is whether they should ask permission or beg forgiveness. Right? One of the classic case studies of scaling in a regulated market that everybody kind of focuses on is Uber. Right? Highly regulated, cities all around the world had regulations and rules that made it very difficult to deploy new technologies that would compete with taxis. And heroically, Travis Kalanick was able to go out and overcome all these regulations and build an incredibly valuable company, right? This is the narrative that we had until relatively recently. Well, the interesting thing is that the costs and consequences for Uber to essentially beg forgiveness, to enter a market, to ignore regulation, to deploy their product, even if that was going to cause backlash from government, were relatively small. Right? Certainly in most US cities, Uber was going to face some fines. Maybe they're going to have a couple cars impounded. Right? They were going to have some issues with government, but the costs, in comparison to the tremendous value they would be able to capture by eventually breaking into that market, were relatively small. It was very asymmetric in Uber's favor. If you contrast that with another startup that many of you may have heard of, 23andMe, which does home genetics testing, right? The consequences of simply saying we're going to sell our product and beg forgiveness were very, very different. So they started deploying their technology. They would allow you to put your spit onto a swab, send it into 23andMe, and 23andMe would send you back a sheet that would tell you the likelihood that you were going to get a certain type of cancer or other genetic-based diseases. And 23andMe followed very much an Uber strategy. They went to market, they started selling this until they got a letter from the Food and Drug Administration that said, we are essentially going to put your executives into prison if you continue to sell a medical technology that doesn't conform to our rules. Right? A very, very different consequence from going to market without permission. And so the strategies that a 23andMe had to deploy and the strategies that an Uber had to deploy were different because they had to understand the consequences of their approach to actually going to market. In other cases, the issue is much less that you have to deal with this question of getting government to change laws, potentially violating those regulations as you try to enter your market. And it's simply different. It's that you have to deal with an issue of inertia, right? That in many markets, government simply moves slowly. This is true in the US, it's true in a lot of other countries. People who work for government face a very different set of incentives than an entrepreneur. Right? An entrepreneur can potentially make a tremendous amount of wealth and get a tremendous amount of positive acclaim by taking a risk. And the costs of failure for an entrepreneur are a lot of the suffering that Fadi talked about, a lot of the barriers that Fadi talked about, but they're relatively low in the greater scheme of things. In contrast, if you're somebody who works for a health system or is a food regulator or otherwise works in government, if you're a bureaucrat, if you're a civil servant, oftentimes, right, you're not going to make 100 times your income if you take a risk and it's successful, right? You don't tend to make massively more money if you do something and succeed, but you can get fired if you take a risk and you screw up. And so, in very rational ways, those people in the world of government tend to move very slowly, very methodically, very predictably, and that can be insanely frustrating for an entrepreneur who wants to move fast. And so if you're trying to enter a new market and you're trying to figure out how to get government to work with you to overcome that inertia, you have to have a strategy on how to do it. You have to be able to perhaps engage citizens and get citizens to help tell government, we want this. You have to be able to maybe engage influencers and go to people who have power and have influence and authority with people in power and convince them why they need to move quickly. You need to identify someone very unique who maybe has a particular incentives to want to take a risk. Right? These are strategies that they don't teach you about when you're reading the classic lean startup and you're reading about needing hackers and designers and engineers in order to build it. The opportunities for those startups that are able to master this skill set, that are able to blend building incredible technology, designing beautiful interfaces, understanding digital channels with a nuanced and sophisticated understanding of how to work with government and how to ultimately make government your ally, are the ones who are going to be the dominant winners of this generation. Right? So we've come through a period where we talk about blitz scaling and growth hacking, and how do we sit there and deploy technologies that can scale to billions of users in a matter of years. And that's been a really interesting and rich period of time, but it's not necessarily the the period of time that we have to be preparing for as entrepreneurs or as investors. This period is going to be defined by understanding how you take technologies of massive potential, but also real significant risk, right? Autonomous cars that can actually kill people, right? Even areas like understanding the consequences of Facebook on our health and a lot of the social media, and understanding how you grow, you can scale, but also how you do it in a way that respects the role that government plays in regulating the safety and protection of citizens. I have a book coming out in June, as you may have mentioned, which actually lays all these ideas out, called Regulatory Hacking. And one of the things that I take tremendous pride in the book is that we're able to talk about specific examples with startups from every continent on the planet. So we look at how you apply these concepts not just in Silicon Valley or New York, not just how you apply it in Brussels or London, but how it's being applied in Nairobi, how it's being applied in Dubai, how it's being applied in Singapore or Japan. Right? Very different governmental systems, but very similar concepts and premises in terms of how you actually get change accomplished in these areas. The final thought for this audience in particular is that one of the things that I've seen through all of our work in different markets is that many of the opportunities that are most rich in emerging markets, in Africa, in the Middle East, in places that Turkey has such great access to and that entrepreneurs in Turkey have such great access to, are even more in these kinds of regulated opportunities and regulated sectors. When we look at entrepreneurial opportunities, when we look at startups that we might want to invest in Africa, we often see startups that are looking at really basic core problems, right? How do we help people who might not have access to financial products get access to financial products? How do we get food to market in more efficient ways? How do we deliver basic healthcare in much, much more efficient ways than we might otherwise? And so for an ecosystem like Turkey that has access to so many interesting markets within a short period of time, this skill set, this knowledge set, getting really good at regulatory hacking, is actually particularly valuable and useful because many of these new technologies are actually going to be pioneered in markets like this, even more so than they might be in a London or a Silicon Valley or a Singapore. With that, thank you very much, and I can't wait to hear the startup pitches.